So hi, thanks very much for joining. I'm Ed, head of data analytics at Mollie. I've spent the past 8 years or so working in data analytics, and in that time I've played the role of an engineering manager, I've played the role of a product manager, but it's probably my role as a people manager that's most relevant to the topic of today's talk, which is, of course, self-compassion, how it had an enormous impact on me, and how hopefully I think it can help you too. So perhaps you might be wondering what makes me qualified to talk about this topic, and perhaps the truth is I'm not an expert, but I do have some very relevant personal experience, particularly from the past year or two, which led me to digging very deep into this topic and experiencing firsthand its potential power. So before we dive in, I wanted to start with a quick survey to get a sense of just how self-compassionate we are as a group, okay? And for this, I'm going to ask you to either stand up or raise your hand if you've ever experienced stress as a result of work. I expect. Cool. That shows that we're all human. And you can stay standing until you have an indication to sit down, right? So stay standing if the stress has ever crept into your... stay standing if the stress has ever stuck around for more than, say, a week or two. Okay? Stay standing if the stress has ever crept into your personal life. So, for example, if it's ever caused you to lose some sleep. Yep. What was it wrong still? Okay. Stay standing if you've ever tried to overcome the stress and regain control of your situation by working even harder. All right. Wow. Cool. And finally, stay standing if in hindsight you genuinely believe that working harder was the right approach to overcoming your stress. This is...
I guess better than rationally I did.
Well, you can sit down. The point I was trying to illustrate here is that I think many of us realize that often working harder to overcome our stresses is not the right approach, but we still do it. And by the way, I'm no exception, and that's because last year I experienced an episode of burnout where I suffered from chronic stress, which lasted for several months. So I had countless sleepless nights, laying in bed, replaying events from work the past day. I felt continually overwhelmed, and I even started to develop feelings of resentment towards my employer. And so what did I do? Did I tell HR? Did I tell my manager? No, of course not. I did what many of us have been conditioned to do in this kind of situation, and I soldiered on, telling myself everything was fine, much like this guy. But when I started to see that my response was ineffective, like you, I cranked things up a notch and I tried to compensate and regain control of the situation by working even harder. And you know how the story goes. What eventually happened is that I was drained of all my energy and I had literally nothing left for my relationship, my social life, or my hobbies. And after a few months of this, I reached my limit and I was left physically, mentally, and emotionally broken. But my burnout is not the topic of this presentation. What I'm actually here to discuss is what I found to be the antidote to my burnout, which is something I was previously lacking, something I suspect that many of us could benefit from having a bit more of in our lives. And that, of course, is self-compassion. So in this talk, I hope to do three things. First, I want to help you understand what self-compassion actually means. Next, I want to convince you of its profound benefits. And then finally, I want to show you how you can practice it yourself and how, as leaders, you can promote it within your teams. So, what actually is self-compassion? This is the definition according to one expert. So self-compassion is the extension of kindness, care, warmth, and understanding towards oneself when faced with shortcomings, inadequacies, or failures. To put this in more simple terms, self-compassion is just about treating yourself in the same way that you would treat a loved one during moments of suffering. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I won't attempt to go into too much detail around how or why self-compassion works. But it boils down to the fact that our biology is evolved in such a way that these things, kindness, care, warmth, and understanding, help us regulate our emotions and form social bonds. And we can actually exploit this aspect of our biology. And rather than outsourcing our need for these rather than outsourcing our need for these things to others, instead we can actually generate them internally ourselves. So Buddhists first realized this in East Asia some 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, but somehow it's only really in the past 20 years or so that the concept of self-compassion started to gain more attention in the West, within academia and psychology. And because it's still such a new concept over here, I think it's still quite often misunderstood. And so just to make sure we all understand what self-compassion is, I think it's just as important to bust a few of these misconceptions and talk about what self-compassion is not. And so one of the most common assumptions that people make about self-compassion is that it's a form of self-pity. And of course, I'm here to tell you this is not true. And that's because when you engage in self-pity, you tend to isolate yourself from others. And this fuels the belief that your problems are unique, and it paints you as a victim. Self-compassion, on the other hand, recognizes that you're not the only one that's suffering. It recognizes that suffering is a shared part of the human experience, and this makes you feel less isolated, more connected to others, and this helps alleviate some of that pain. Another common misconception around self-compassion, and one I think that is particularly damaging, is that it's soft or weak or touchy-feely, and that through being too soft on yourself, this makes you complacent. And I cannot stress enough, this is all complete nonsense. So self-compassion is simply about cultivating a healthy and balanced relationship with yourself. And as we'll see later, rather than making you complacent, self-compassion can actually increase your levels of motivation. And then the final myth I'd like to bust is that self-compassion is an act of selfishness. And trust me when I tell you this could not be further from the truth. And the reason for this is that when you practice self-compassion, the benefits are not only felt by you, but they're actually spread to everyone around you, whether that be your friends or your family or your colleagues. And to illustrate this, I can share with you a story from my earlier days of being a manager. But I should warn you that the story doesn't have a particularly happy ending. So the story involves me and a member of my team. Let's call him Fred. Fred looks slightly creepy here. That wasn't exactly my intention. It didn't really look that creepy in real life. But anyway, ultimately, I screwed up and I failed to deliver Fred a piece of critical feedback in the first instance when I observed it. And instead, I gave Fred the feedback sometime later when the time came to decide whether or not to extend his contract. And I think you can imagine how this went down. Fred reported feeling completely blindsided. And of course, he had every right to be furious that I waited until such a critical moment to deliver him this feedback. Now, taken at face value, it might look like I was intentionally trying to deprive Fred of the feedback, but there's actually a little more to it than that. I didn't really realize this at the time, but now in hindsight, what I see more clearly is that I was being held back by my fear of confrontation and concerns around how I would be perceived by Fred.
Yeah.
But this is where self-compassion comes in, or at least I think it's where self-compassion could have helped me, because the first benefit of self-compassion is that it allows us to let go of our need for external validation. So the idea here is that through approaching these kinds of situations with kindness and understanding towards ourselves, we acknowledge the need for prioritizing our own well-being and making choices that serve us. So in my situation, self-compassion would have made it possible to let go of caring so much about what Fred thought about me, and instead do the right thing and confront the situation by giving Fred the critical feedback that he deserved to know about. And yes, that might have been slightly uncomfortable, but I think it's a whole lot better than the situation that I ended up finding myself in. Another benefit of self-compassion is that it can turbocharge your personal development. And as engineering leaders, I'm sure you'll agree that this is particularly important. And to illustrate how it does this, I'd ask you to think about what you'd say to a loved one or to a child when they're going through a right patch. So hopefully you wouldn't criticize them and point out everything they've done wrong. Hopefully you would validate their painful emotions and encourage them to keep on going by emphasizing their efforts and their progress. So in other words, you'd show them compassion. Well, as it happens, our brains are wired to respond in exactly the same way, whether the talk is coming from external sources like a parent or our manager, or internally from ourselves. And as I mentioned before, we can exploit this aspect of our biology by changing the way that we talk to ourselves when, say, we receive a piece of critical feedback, when we run into difficulty. Instead of punishing ourselves, like so many of us have been conditioned to do with self-compassion, we recognize that our imperfections are what makes us human. And this makes it so much easier to listen to critical feedback, to own our mistakes, and to take responsibility for our actions. And all of this results in the fact that we see a massive increase in levels of personal development and motivation. And then the final benefit of self-compassion is that through becoming less absorbed by our own difficult emotions, we make more room for others. So we become more curious, more open, and more aware of how other people are feeling. And I must say that I've actually experienced this really profound jump in my capacity for empathy. Now, I may not yet have Mother Teresa levels, but I suspect that many people I'm close to would recognize that compared to just a year or two ago, I'm now more open, I'm a better listener, I'm more understanding, and because of all of this, I'm more cooperative during conflicts, especially when things can get heated. And shock, the quality of many of my closest relationships has gone through the roof, and I've no doubt that this is because of self-compassion. So now, rather than me telling you how you can practice self-compassion, I thought it would be more beneficial if you could experience it for yourself. So, time for an exercise to illustrate the 3 components of self-compassion. But before we even get to the self-compassion part, I'd ask you to call to mind a recent situation from work that you found challenging. So this could be a difficult conversation you've recently had. It could be some kind of interpersonal conflict, or since I'm talking to a group of engineering leaders, maybe it's some kind of incident that you've been dealing with. Doesn't really matter as long as it's something that's caused you some distress. So I'll give you a moment to do this, and maybe you can just give me a little hand wave or something when you've thought of something. Cool, I see some nods. Then on to the first component of self-compassion, which is awareness or self-awareness. And this is the idea that when we're suffering, so often we let our painful emotions consume us. So for example, we might relentlessly punish ourselves about a mistake that we made, or we might ruminate endlessly about how rude a colleague was to us. So the first step of self-compassion is to break this cycle and acknowledge your situation and become aware of any painful emotions that you might be feeling. And so now I want you to have a go and do this for yourselves. So with respect to your situation, think about how it makes you feel. So for example, perhaps it makes you angry, disappointed, or some other painful emotion. And maybe you can just give me a nod again when you've done that. It's a loss. The second component of self-compassion is common humanity. And this is the idea that even though so often when we're suffering, we feel so alone and we feel so isolated, the truth is that everyone experiences painful situations and personal inadequacy. It's just what it means to be human. And so to emphasize this idea that we're not alone when we're struggling, I'd ask you to think about what your situation shares in common with others. And in particular, I'd ask you to try and think about someone that you know who might have experienced a similar situation to yours, whether that be a friend or a family member or a colleague. If that's too difficult for you, then feel free just to think about someone who's experienced similar emotions to yours, maybe. And I'll give you another moment to do this. And then, finally, the third and final component of self-compassion is kindness. And to illustrate this, I'd ask you to think about what you'd say to a loved one if they were experiencing a situation. And if you need some inspiration here, again, perhaps you might validate their painful emotions. Perhaps you might let them know that you're there for them. Or perhaps you might remind them that they're strong and encourage them to keep on going. And one final time, I'll give you a moment to do this for yourselves. And then to tie it all together, if you feel comfortable, I'd ask you to close your eyes for just a moment. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, feel free just to gaze at something on the floor that's not moving. The important thing is that you can pay attention. And once again, I'd ask you to call to mind your challenging situation and think about how it makes you feel. And don't try and change the feeling, just notice it.
Happy.
And take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And now I'd like you to try and visualize the person or the people that you thought of who've experienced similar situations to yours. And take a moment to remind yourself that your situation is not unique and that many other people have experienced similar situations and they've come out stronger. And so you can too. But you don't need to take my word for this, because each of you has your own encouraging message, which you just thought of. And so what I want you to do now is take these words and direct them towards yourself. And if this feels a little unnatural, don't worry, this is completely normal. But to the best of your ability, in your head, take these words, direct them towards yourself. And when you do, really try and mean it. So really try and connect with the words, their meaning, their intention, and really try and feel this for yourself, like you really wish the best for yourself. And I'll give you just another moment to do this. And then you can take one more deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And for anyone who still has their eyes closed, you can open your eyes. Well done. You've just practiced the 3 components of self-compassion. So first, you became aware of your situation and acknowledged any painful emotions that you might be feeling. Next, you recognized the common humanity. So you recognized that your experience is not unique and that many other people are struggling just like you. And then finally, you showed yourself kindness in exactly the same way that you would show to a loved one. And by the way, this is just one example of what a self-compassion exercise could look like. If you're interested in experiencing more exercises for yourself, then you can go to selfcompassion.org, where you can find many others. For example, exercises based around journaling, which are more suitable to do on your own. So now that we all understand the benefits of self-compassion, and now that you're all prepared to practice it out there in the wild, as leaders, how can you promote self-compassion in your teams? Well, I believe that one of the most powerful ways is by leading by example and modeling the kinds of self-compassionate behaviors we hope to see from others. And I think this starts with demonstrating what a healthy work-life balance looks like. So, for example, when you're required to work overtime, make sure you compensate with plenty of rest. When you're feeling unwell, don't try and be a hero and push through. Actually take sick days. You're aiming to send the message that health and well-being always come first. And I know maybe this might sound like basic advice, it might sound a bit patronizing, but as leaders, it's so easy to forget about our own needs when we're under pressure, when we're moving quickly, or when we're so focused on the needs of other people. But if you can't practice what you preach, then frankly, your team won't trust you. So be sure to show that taking care of yourself is a priority. My next tip for promoting self-compassionate work is to celebrate inadequacy. And no, when I say this, I'm not suggesting that we throw a party and crack open a bottle of champagne whenever something goes wrong at work, when someone makes a mistake. What I'm advocating for is that we reframe mistakes and other inadequacies as learning opportunities. So I've been doing this for a while now. Whenever something goes wrong at work, whenever someone makes a mistake, I really try my best to hold back any judgments, any criticisms, and try and see the best in the situation by asking what we can learn from it. And provided we're sincere here, this can be a really effective approach for nurturing self-compassion. But I should point out that this only works if we follow Rule 1 and take responsibility for our own inadequacies by showing clearly how we're learning from them. And one approach that I found to be really effective here is every 6 months at work, during our performance review cycle, when I receive upward feedback from my whole team, what I do is I take away this feedback, extract from it the common themes, and present back to them some kind of a plan around how I intend to act on it. And this sets the precedent to them that inadequacies are not something to be ashamed of, but they're an opportunity to learn and grow. Bless you. My final tip for promoting self-compassion at work is to promote self-awareness. And the way that I recommend doing this is by subtly highlighting and maybe even gently challenging excessive negativity, whether that appears as self-doubt or self-criticism or perfectionism or something else. I'd say just be sure not to overdo it here, because the last thing you want to do is to mollycoddle anyone and make them dependent on your advice. You're just aiming to create a bit more self-awareness by giving them a gentle push in the right direction so that they can then do the rest for themselves. So, I know I've already discussed the benefits of self-compassion, but I would just point out here that you really see these benefits multiply when it's applied at a team level and you start to see it impact your team's culture. So you see more effective communication, collaboration, teamwork, and then since team members feel less afraid to make mistakes, you see more risk-taking, and this leads to faster innovation and faster learning. So just imagine what the world could look like if we all practice self-compassion. So now, here I am, about 1.5 years on since my burnout started, and I'm glad to say that it's completely resolved. Now, that's not to say that I don't get stressed anymore. Of course I still do, but I've now got the tools at my disposal to help manage it, and I must say that self-compassion is one of the most effective ones that I've found. And so now, a piece of homework for you. And that's, next time you're experiencing a difficult situation at work, to have a go and try and practice some self-compassion. So first, become aware of your situation and acknowledge any painful emotions that you might be feeling. Then next, recognize the common humanity. So recognize that your situation is not unique and that many other people are struggling just like you. And then finally, show yourself a little kindness. Remind yourself that you're trying your best, and that's already enough. Thank you.